You are listening to the Visualizing War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies.
Hello, my name is Alice Koenig.
And my name is Nicolas Vierter.
And we co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. Our guests today are two of our colleagues at the university, Professor Tony Lang, Jr. of the School of International Relations, and Dr Rory Cox, Senior Lecturer at the School of History. Tony's research focuses on how politics, law, and ethics intersect at the global level, with a particular emphasis on human rights, international obligations and responsibilities, and the just war tradition. Within these different areas, he's focused on forms of global power, international law, and military interventions. And in his work, he engages with great 20th century thinkers and theorists, such as Hans Morgenthau, Hannah Arendt, and Judith Sklar, as well as historical figures such as Aristotle and Hugo Grotius. Rory's research is centered on the ethics of war, the history of violence, and intellectual history. And he explores these topics with an impressively wide chronological range, including ancient Egyptian just war doctrine, medieval military history, debates on the use of torture, and the history of terrorism. And engaging different approaches to these questions from different disciplines such as history, international relations, sociology, and anthropology is a key part of his research. So ethics, the just war tradition, intellectual history, and also narrative traditions are really crucial areas of overlap and mutual interest here between both our guests and also with our interests in the Visualising War project. So we're really looking forward to exploring these with Rory and Tony today. Welcome to the Visualising War podcast. It's fantastic to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And it's a great project, so I'm glad I could be part of it.
Thanks very much. Yeah, also very glad to be part of it.
So to kick us off, maybe I could come to you first, Rory, and just ask you to explain what exactly is the just war tradition. Can you tell us a bit about when and where it originated and what it's all about?
When we're thinking about the just war tradition, we're really thinking about streams of thought that assume a relationship between war and justice. That's a fundamental presumption, I suppose, or assumption of the type of thought that we're interested in. To reject that sort of a relationship would be, say, pacifism, for example, where you just think that there is no relationship between war and justice, that they're antipathetic. The just war tradition, traditionally conceived, is usually associated broadly with the Greco-Romano and then the later Christian tradition, which then gets developed into the early modern period and into the modern international law, effectively. There are two major elements of the tradition. The one is called the jus ad bellum, and this is really asking questions about under what circumstances and when is war justifiable. So traditionally this is focused on questions such as authority, who has the authority to declare war or decide to go to war? Is it a private individual or is it a public authority such as a king? There is then an element called just cause. So in other words, why can you go to war? So self-defense would probably be the classic example of that, but then there's also such things as defense of rights, defense of territory, defense of allies, defense of faith or religion. And then finally, which is really a Christian development from the time of, say, St. Ambrose and St. Augustine in late antiquity onwards, we begin to see debates centering on correct intention. This is asking the question, why are you going to war? Are you going to war for venal reasons? Are you going to war for simple hatred and revenge and bloodlust and the desire to dominate? Or are you doing it to protect the innocent, to serve your God, to serve your community, to be sort of an arbiter and an executor of justice? So that's what we might think of as the jus ad bellum strain of the tradition. The second major strain we think of as the jus in bello, or often confused and merged with the jus armorum, the law of arms. And this really concentrates on how to behave once war has begun. Can you summarily kill prisoners of war, for example? Can you set fire to non-combatant buildings? Can you loot temples or churches? Now, there is a lot of debate among just war scholars about when exactly these two different streams emerge and when they converge. And James Turner Johnson, who's a very prominent historian of the just war tradition, argues that actually these two independent areas of just war thinking, thought about going to war and the thought about actions within war, don't actually converge until the very end of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. However, as the just war tradition has developed over time, and more recently, for example, there's new areas of thought have come in. For example, justice after war. So, it's all very well to go to war and it's all very well to behave properly whilst you're there. But what happens when you leave? Do you have a responsibility, for example, for reconstruction and to make sure that the society that you have waged war against is left in some sort of order that they can rebuild themselves? And then other questions about proportionality and probability of success. These are all debated within the tradition as well. The reason why it's such a complex question is that there's no real consensus on anything that I've said. There are lots of people who disagree with it. And actually, I'm one of them. So I have been trying to make the argument for quite a long time that just war thought is actually much older than St. Augustine, who usually is penned as the father of the just war tradition, and is even older than thinkers like Cicero or Aristotle or Plato even, and can actually be traced back into the second or even third millennium BCE. On top of that, you also have just war thought traditions in China emerging around the 5th century BCE, and also in India as well. There's certainly elements of just war thought within the Mahabharata, for example. We tend to think of the just war tradition as a Western tradition, and I think this is often a product of our kind of Eurocentric scholarship. And I would certainly argue that we need to think about it a bit more broadly than that. But I think one important thing to underline is that the just war tradition in many ways is a tradition which provides a set of questions. It doesn't necessarily provide a set of answers. And the answers that it does provide, if it does provide any, are vigorously debated and highly subjective. So it's more about questioning when and how to wage war, rather than necessarily saying this is how you do it.
Thanks so much, Rory. And that emphasis there on the just war tradition as prompting questions is really, really valuable, not the sort of code of conduct that people sort of simply subscribe to. It's really interesting to hear you talk about the way in which actually we need to look kind of a long way back in history and well beyond sort of Western thought to trace the role that I suppose ethics have always played in historic as well as contemporary habits of visualizing war.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a significant amount of psychological research, for example, that basically underlines the fact that killing other human beings is an extremely traumatic action and that it has an impact on individuals. So, trying to convince individuals to do that is sometimes difficult, and you have to construct explanations for why it's okay, particularly when you blend that with, say, religious belief. Right and wrong action in this world will affect your afterlife. Then again, you have to convince potential soldiers that what they do in war won't necessarily condemn them in the next world, if that's what they believe or believed in. I think the other thing which often gets forgotten, though, is that when people go to war, you're not just trying to convince soldiers to kill, you're asking them to potentially die. And that is often forgotten about in a lot of just war literature. So you have to have pretty strong norms and moral reasoning and ideology, whether that's political or religious belief, to convince people that actually it's also worth going off and getting yourself killed. So justice becomes a kind of a crucial element to hang those arguments off, that actually you can kill and still do that correctly, and also that this thing is actually worth dying for. I would argue that goes back to pre-literate societies. Obviously, we can only speculate about that, but there's no reason why oral traditions wouldn't have developed those sorts of debates and ideas long before they started writing them down.
I think from a classicist and ancient historical perspective, thinking about the just war tradition is also very interesting because there's this very strong tendency at the moment to adopt what's called the realist approach to ancient societies, which argues that going to war was just a matter of course to most of them. They weren't really that bothered about it. It was just normal to them. But I think the very fact that we have such strong intellectual traditions that think about justifications of war is actually a good counterweight to that and could prompt us to take this side of ancient societies in particular a bit more seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a strand in realist international political theory that has engaged with just war thinking and has branded it as just war thinking, as a sort of a famous kind of pithy phrase. And it makes exactly that argument that these debates, however well articulated and conceived, are essentially just masking realist power assertions and desires to acquire resources or whatever it may be. I think that grossly underestimates and oversimplifies why people go to war in the first place. And that's not to dismiss what we might think of as traditional realist motivations. Of course, these are important. There are plenty of examples of war which are quite clearly antithetical to realist interests. Plenty of people have gone to war that has harmed their physical security, that has depleted their material resources, that have put their populations in the way of harm. So that doesn't really stack up, particularly as well when you consider religious-based conflict, unless you're just simply willing to completely dismiss religion as a complex disguise for realist motivations, which I think, again, would be grossly oversimplifying matters. Then how does a realist explain religious conflict?
What we see already in your answer, Rory, is how law, ethics, politics intersect in the whole question, but also seems to me, there are two sides to just war thinking. On the one hand, there's a kind of protection of the potential victims of war, but also there's a protection of the potential aggressor, in the sense that the aggressor has to define and decide whether they actually want to shoulder the costs of the war in terms of monetary costs, economic costs, cost of life. So decision making is very important here. So I suppose the follow-up question I have for you, Tony, is now, when we look from antiquity to the present, how important is this just war tradition still today? How important is it to be aware of this? How does it influence contemporary thinking about war and decision making?
Yeah, there's different answers to that question, which is a really important one. There's answers within the academic realm, the debates about just war, and then there's answers that are relevant, I think, in the policy realm. So in the academic realm, I think one of the things that's happened with the just war tradition is it's become, for some, a very analytic, philosophical tradition, kind of defined by a series of rules, and Rory kind of hinted at some of the categories those rules fall into. And there's a lot of interesting ideas that come out of that analytic philosophy tradition. I mean, I tend to be somewhat skeptical of some of that because it can reduce it to just a tick box exercise. So if I got this right, if I got this right, if I get this right, my war is just and I can go forward. And again, that's within the kind of philosophical realm, particular forms of philosophy. Again, there are some really interesting things that have come out of that, though, ways that force us to think more carefully about what are these categories and kind of diving in depth to what the meanings of them are. So there is some good debates that have gone on around that. Within the policy realm, it's kind of interesting to think about whether or not does just war function. So one thing that's happened, some people argue, is that the in bello questions, those concerning what you can do in war, have very much made their way into international law. So you do have things like the beginning of the 20th century, the Hague Conventions, and the mid-20th century, the Geneva Conventions. These are very much informed by this kind of long-standing reflections about what's just and what's not. And these rules are taken very seriously by not only international lawyers, but military practitioners. Every military has a kind of code of ethics that it uses. So that has a very concrete application in a lot of ways. Perhaps the odd bellum side, the whether or not it's just to go to war, I don't know if prime ministers and presidents and leaders, bring in philosophers to consult on these questions. But like I think Rory was hinting at, which I completely agree with, it's almost hard to imagine people making decisions without thinking about, is this right or not? So one of the problems with modern social science, kind of how I was trained as a political scientist, is that people say, well, the normative is one thing and the empirical is something else. And these don't connect at all. So you can have what needs to be done to protect the nation, but underlying that, of course, is a set of normative moral assumptions. And so we all act in ways, including leaders of countries. So it's sometimes hard to parse out. I think it does become infused within lots of ways of thinking. And it's something that people in the military, people in policy circles do know of, and they're often trained in. So I've worked with the British military and the American military in different contexts, and they all know the tradition. They all know those categories. And so they play a role in their thinking, maybe not formally, but certainly in the background. So yeah, I do think it matters. It's hard to trace, right? You can't see it directly, but I think it's there, certainly.
And Tony, just following up on that, one question I've got is whether, in your experience of looking at it, whether the just war tradition tends to serve states more than individuals. I suppose this kind of comes down in some ways to, whose interests is it serving? And I suppose it comes a little bit down to storytelling as well. I think some of your research has looked a lot at narrative and narrative authority and the relationship between narrative and the justification of violence. So I wonder if you could say a bit about that as well.
So just on the first part of your question, Alice, I think it's a good one. The tradition, as Rory said, one of the big principles of the tradition is authority. A lot of figures in the tradition ask the good, important question, can an individual wage war? And most people say, no, I can't wage war against you. That doesn't make sense. I could get in a fight with you, but a war has to be done by a community. So in some sense, the decision to go to war has to be undertaken by some organized community. Today, we think of the sovereign state system. So it's sovereign states that go to war, and that's what makes sense. And some figures in the tradition and contemporary figures have made the case that you don't have to be a sovereign state to justifiably use military force. There's what some might call terrorist groups, what others might call liberation groups. So, there's lots of different answers to that question that then make it more complicated, our assumptions about who's authorized to go to war. When it comes to who gets protected, I think the in bello tradition does work to protect individuals. Now, again, that's become complicated because who counts as a civilian versus who counts as a military personnel. It was never very simple. It's become even more complicated today. So one of the big things today is cyber warfare, right? And so does that count as war? Kind of, but it also impacts everybody. And individuals can do that who don't wear uniforms, but they can be authorized by states. So there's lots of complexities about kind of keeping those two categories of people separate. Maybe one way to put it is the way we have narrated the tradition, so to speak. We have given authority to publicly authorized communities. And maybe that's one way to think about how narration functions. I think narration functions in different ways that maybe we could talk about in a few minutes, but that might be one connection there.
I think if we were looking broadly at just war thought across cultures and across time, then we would have to conclude that it is associated with the rise of states or complex political communities, however you want to define those. Mainly because it's only complex political communities who have the resources to wage large-scale violence, and it's large-scale violence that we would term war. Now, of course, what large-scale violence is relative. If you live on an island with a population of 1,000 and that consists of two tribes of 500, then you can have full-scale warfare between them, even though the death toll may only be in the tens or the low hundreds. Proportionally, of course, that would be a massive percent of their population. Equally, you can have a war between two superpowers consisting of hundreds of millions of people and tens of millions can die. And it's usually communities that fight wars. Like Tony said, as an individual, you can have a fight or you can have a brawl, but that's something different to war. So it has been in the interest of communities, therefore, to create ideologies, essentially, and building from that kind of moral systems, often based in pre-existing moral systems, that essentially excuse or justify or explain or condone or whatever it may be, going to war and killing other people and risking one's own life.
The narrative point, I think, connects with what Rory is saying here, because in the contemporary world, nation states narrate themselves into existence, right? So things like borders and national interests, all these terms we use are, of course, artificial. They're not, you can't see a border, you can't see a national interest. Those things don't exist. So we have to narrate those. And they're often narrated with an ideology, but those ideologies are intensely normative. They have moral meanings to them. So my favorite philosopher, Hannah Arendt, argues that any action that anybody takes has to be narrated to make sense. You have to tell a story about it for it to be meaningful. And war is a classic example of that. War can't just be without meaning, right? It has to have some, and oftentimes that meaning is intensely moral or moralistic, depending on how you want to use that phrase. So I think that would maybe build on Rory's point about ideology, that we sometimes think of nation states having ideologies, but those are moral claims upon the world. And sometimes they become, the just war tradition is also problematic in its past, and it's come back a little bit in contemporary world. So Rory said one of the odd bellum claims is often self-defense, which kind of makes sense in our normal way of thinking. We should defend ourselves, so our nation should defend it. But one of the one that's appeared more recently, particularly around things like humanitarian intervention, is punishment. And that's an older claim. That was one of the classic, you could have three reasons for going to war. One is self-defense, punishment, or to take back what had been taken from you. And the punishment one is, we think that, like any international lawyer, you mentioned this too, we can't punish. That's not a legitimate reason to use war. But when you hear the language of a humanitarian intervention, it's sometimes, well, we have to help people and then we have to punish the bad guys. So there's a kind of punishment element that feeds itself in. So the meaning we give to those kind of interventions is very moralistic and can become very problematic because there isn't an overarching kind of structure in place that enables us to punish or that justifies punishment. And yet states will use that language often. So that can be a way in which that moral ideology, that narration can become more problematic as opposed to one we might all accept.
I think I've come across some work by Cian O'Driscoll on that very point, looking at the 2003 invasion of Iraq and George Bush's rhetoric, all about the axis of evil. And very much, the way in which George Bush's speeches and so on really did leverage this idea almost of punishment, kind of taking us back to quite a medieval approach to warfare almost. So that ties in.
Absolutely. And Cian is a good friend of both Rory and I's, and he's written extensively. And it's a really important argument. He did some really good work looking at that particular war and the way that language has shaped the way we think about warfare. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a fundamental tension within the just war tradition when you view it in the context of complex political communities. And that tension is that the relationship that it posits between violence and justice is fundamentally different to the relationship that most communities posit between violence and justice in the domestic everyday sphere. So most communities, large communities, rely on justice as a way to create a coherent, workable community. You don't go around stealing from everyone, that you don't go around using violence willy-nilly, that you don't just kill people ad hoc. Any community that follows those sorts of rules of behavior, A, is not going to flourish particularly effectively, and B, is probably going to be quite short-lived. The problem for the state or the public authority, however it may be then, is to say that's okay in the domestic sphere, but when we're interacting in the external sphere, that all gets thrown out the window. Now you're allowed to go and kill people. You're allowed to go and maim people. You're allowed to steal and loot and plunder. You're allowed to burn down. You're allowed to enslave your prisoners, whatever it may be. So the problem for the state is to flip from giving a certain way of behaving in the domestic sphere to a very different way of behaving in the international or external sphere. And the way that it has done that is to essentially posit that war is such an extraordinary state of affairs, that it's so unusual, that it's so different from our everyday quotidian existence, that fundamentally different rules apply to it. Different moral rules, ethical rules, and different, very importantly, legal rules. Now that has been the kind of the underlying assumption of the just war tradition or just war thought, really, I would argue, since its inception, that it's a way of behaving differently, but still trying to justify that behavior within dominant cultural value systems. Tony mentioned just previously the strain of kind of more modern analytic philosophical work on the just war, often referred to as the revisionist tradition, which actually rejects that basis of argument, that it says that war should not be thought of as an independent moral or legal realm, and actually it's just an extension of our everyday realm. So a moral or an immoral or a legal or an illegal action in our everyday life should be considered in a very similar way when we do that in war. So that includes things like liability to harm and punishment, as Tony was just saying, and harming the innocent, for example. So these are fundamental arguments made by the likes of Jeff McMahon and David Rodin and others. And that really is one of the key kind of points of argument that modern just war debates are kind of fought over, whether war is something that is really unique and has a kind of a metaphysical existence almost of its own, or whether it's simply an extension of our everyday activities and essentially the same rules should apply.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think that's a great point. And one practical way to see that is the difference between a police officer and a soldier, right? And a police officer's role is to kind of diffuse tension, to ensure that people aren't using violence to kind of step in between people, ensure that justice is being done, and criminal justice. Whereas a soldier's job is to kill other people, right? And as the American military says, our job is to kill people and break things, right? I mean, that's kind of what they do. Simplifying, of course, there. But one interesting thing that's happened, just as an aside, in debates about policing in the United States right now, one of the interesting developments has been that many police officers are former military members in the US, and they also get training. They only get like 6 weeks or so, as opposed to a place like Norway, where they have to get a BA in policing to be a police officer. So they go for 4 years to a university. So what's interesting that what's happened is that some of the thinking about conduct yourself with weapons and in situations of perhaps conflict, if you're coming with a military perspective as opposed to a police officer's perspective, there'll be very different outcomes. So I've read a few things that says that's one of the problems about the policing situation in the United States right now, et cetera, et cetera. That just demonstrates Rory's point, which there is a difference between using force in a domestic society where you're a citizen versus using force against someone else who your enemy. And that makes a big difference about how we understand what should or shouldn't be done.
If I may, Tony, I just want to pick up on that really, really fascinating contrast there between, for example, US and Scandinavian police training. But I just want to pick up on that point you made about the soldier's job and think about storytelling again. You talked earlier about the sort of the jus in bello, all these ideas about the laws of armed conflict and so on, becoming codes of conduct and sort of almost instinctive soldiers. And I do some training with the British Army, and I think the soldiers I have worked with would really fundamentally reject that idea that the soldier's job is to kill people and break things, partly because they've spent so long wrestling with all the jus in bello ideas. And so I suppose my question is, to what extent do different militaries have different cultures, but also has the just war tradition increasingly perhaps over the last couple of centuries changed a soldier's sense of identity?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. And I should also say, U.S. military people probably wouldn't like that phrase either anymore. So I think you're right. But there certainly are national differences. But I think what is interesting, the British use of military force, so to speak, or operations have largely been in the last 50 years. Interventions, whether they're humanitarian, places like Sierra Leone. Other than engaging in the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the British military has been what we might call constabulary kind of operations, which then leads to the kinds of assumptions that you're mentioning, Alice, which is, their role is to be protecting, providing humanitarian aid, all those kind of things. And so there's a way in which the lack of major wars, so to speak, has shaped the way not just British, but military officers around the world, soldiers around the world see what their role is. Now, that's not to say there aren't live wars and there aren't real conflicts going on, but it does seem like there's, in some ways, those kind of operations do change. And the just war tradition has tried to speak to some of that. I and others have used that tradition to think about intervention, but it's a slightly, you have to change because you're not fighting an enemy, you're doing something different.
I guess I have a question that's related to that, but that also takes us back to what we were saying earlier, this sort of complex relationship between civilians and soldiers, and who has the right and authority to declare war, what's a war. And sort of one of the key words here, I suppose, is terrorism, and the way in which terrorism has risen and has developed over the last few years. And I think I have a question also for Rory here, because I was quite struck by a paper of yours in which you were analyzing the ways in which Western states, and it takes us back to the question of narrative as well, including the US and the UK, have justified this so-called war on terrorism. And at one point you say language both reflects and constructs reality, and understanding language helps us understand better state-perpetrated acts of violence. So I wonder, Rory, could you tell us a bit more also about sort of the way in which terrorism and the rise of terrorism has influenced the whole just war debate and the relationship between narrative and justification and ethics and war?
Yeah. So, I mean, narrative and war obviously is the central interest of this podcast and the project. Goes back as long as we know, oral traditions and then into literary traditions as well. The way that warfare and soldiers are framed by various literary genres and narrative traditions is absolutely crucial to thinking about how war has been largely accepted and condoned in human history and across most cultures. Pacifism as such is an incredibly rare phenomenon, actually. Terrorism, of course, is no different. And the way that the so-called war on terror, as if, you could wage war on a kind of an abstract concept, it has been promoted and legitimized through various states, not just Western, that should be underlined, has drawn from a variety of historical tropes, essentially pulling from various narratives across time and space. When I talk about, language and the importance of language, this is really pulling on ideas associated with postmodern theory, particularly about how the language that we use, it reflects our reality to a certain extent, but it also constructs it because it enables us to think in certain ways, or it demands us to think in certain ways. So in other words, how do we describe war? Well, that seems like a very obvious question, but then imagine that we didn't have the piece of vocabulary war or warfare or conflict or combat or soldier or hero or civilian. How then do you describe war to an outsider without any of those terms? Immediately you start to see that actually the language we have at our disposal is shaping the way that we are conceiving something. To make another sort of simplistic point, imagine that I introduced you to an individual who you had never met before. If I introduce you to this, let's say it's a woman, let's say I introduce this woman as a criminal, as dangerous, psychotic, violent, a terrorist, you will immediately form an image in your mind. It will influence your reactions, etc., about what this woman is. If I introduce this woman as a humanitarian, a philanthropist, a genius, and an all-round kind of good egg, again, you are immediately forming ideas and preconceptions about this woman's behavior and your possible relationship to her. Now, neither of those introductions may be based on reality in terms of this woman's real biography, and yet my simple introduction of her using language has influenced the reality that you are perceiving her through, or the kind of the lens that you conceive her through. Now that's kind of a simple, kind of not particularly good metaphor, but I think it shows why language and the language terms that we use does fundamentally impact and affect the way that we think about things. Tony mentioned earlier the distinction between a terrorist group and a freedom fighter. That's a very important contrast that has been made for centuries. If a newspaper describes a group as terrorist or describes a group as a kind of freedom fighters, that influences the popular perception of that group, which may then have an impact on government policy towards what we do, in whether we fund that group or whether we perhaps stage a so-called humanitarian intervention against that group. I mean, civil war is one of the problems that the just war tradition struggles to deal with, because it comes back to this idea of authority. Because technically, in the modern just war tradition, only the government has authority to wage war. Whereas if that's a tyrannical government, perhaps the rebel group or the terrorists, as a government might call them, is actually morally superior, has actually the valid case. There are certain strains called cosmopolitanism which try to sort of defend the right of non-governmental organizations and groups to wage war with kind of moral purpose, as it were. So language and the language we use is deeply important. I've argued particularly that terrorism has been associated with ideas of barbarism in the modern, in kind of post-2001, but you can actually trace it earlier. And again, I think that's important because when we use the word barbarism in Anglophone or Western discourse more generally, we come at it with very specific ideas of what a barbarian is dangerous, it's destructive, it's antipathetic to civilization. And you mentioned Kean's work on George Bush's speeches. If you look at the American language, but also the UK language, Indian, French, it doesn't matter where you draw it from, you will see repeatedly that the war against terror was again and again put into this trope of the war of civilization against barbarism, that it is essentially kind of an existential struggle, no matter how far from reality that depiction was.
And I think Kean makes the very important point that if you are stacking the odds like that you've got these extremes, these poles, civilization and barbarity, or good and evil, or indeed God and the devil, then you're much less likely to wage war with restraint. And I think that gets me thinking a little
Absolutely.
bit about a point which Tony raised earlier, which is this idea of justice after war as well. The language that we use to describe guerrilla warfare, civil war, genocide, presumably has a huge impact on the justice that might or might not come after war. And I don't know if that's something that, Tony, you want to touch on, having brought that up earlier.
It's sometimes referred to as the jus postbellum. I don't know why they like Latin so much in these.
Well, it's the importance of language again, isn't it, Tony? Just to interrupt there.
It makes it
I mean,
sound better.
just war scholars who have absolutely zero knowledge of Latin still persist in using jus ad bellum, jus in bello, jus postbellum, and a range of other Latin terms or sort of neo-Latin terms because it adds authority. Right? That's essentially why they're doing it. They're pulling on the history of the tradition to add authority to their neologisms or to their new theories.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's an interesting point about language and its authority in and of itself. And the postbellum stuff, it is interesting, and it's interesting how that's where the justice side comes in very strongly. And you have less the just war tradition. I find this more, I guess, in international legal debates about things like international tribunals, international criminal courts. What should you do after a conflict with those who lost or those who were perhaps committing atrocities? How are you supposed to treat them? Raises all sorts of questions about, the hypocrisy of the winners. Is this just victor's justice? So the most famous one, right, the Nuremberg trials. It's hard to justify saying that the Nazis were good guys. So, it seems like they should have been put on trial, and putting them on trial seemed to be a good idea. But the more complicated case was the Tokyo trials, which was in the Far East, and putting Japanese on trial. And the arguments that were made against them in that particular trial were less convincing because in many of the cases, U.S. Military had used similar tactics and, of course, had dropped the atomic bomb. So it seems like could be justification there for putting U.S. officials on trial for that decision, right? I mean, in the way that obviously didn't get dealt with at all. Having said that, I do think that, the creation of the International Criminal Court, which deals with these things at a global level, is a good thing. It's unfortunate that it's dealt largely only with African conflicts, but it is opened up investigations in other places. Postbellum can include things like trials, courts, etc. There were debates after the Iraq War of 2003, when the U.S. put in place a new political system, ultimately. And efforts to eliminate anyone who was involved with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, which in a sense disabled the Iraqi government then from functioning because everybody was a member of the Ba'ath Party. So that you try to remove them from any position of authority, that didn't seem like a good postbellum project because it left this country without any expertise about governance. So that's maybe a more problematic example as well.
Just to add to Tony's point there about the Tokyo war crimes trials and the way that history is often conveniently forgotten and new narratives invented all the time, is that in 1946, a number of Japanese prison guards were executed for waterboarding American prisoners of war. Whereas, 60 years later, or less than 60 years later, you have the Bush administration and a series of legal memos which are now published and widely discussed, claiming that waterboarding isn't torture and that it's an enhanced interrogation technique and that it's actually perfectly legitimate for American intelligence operatives to utilize it as an intelligence gathering technique. So, a number of people, including myself, have written and mentioned this, that, waterboarding and the way that it was represented as non-torturous was essentially a kind of a new mythologizing. It was a new narrative created to fulfill the needs of the time. Fortunately, it hasn't been totally convincing, but it did convince many, and it convinced many in positions of power, unfortunately.
And interesting how to make those narratives work, it was very legalistic, the language that was used and the arguments that were used. And, and that's an example of how politics, law, ethics all kind of come together to construct justifications for policies that were then also part of the war on terror. It wasn't not just gathering information. I think there was definitely a punitive element to a number of those uses of enhanced interrogation and what I would call torture. And I think that's interesting how, while they say they're just getting information, there's a certain point at which it just makes Especially if you look at things like in Iraq, the way torture was used in the prisons there and by American soldiers and guards, that was clearly punitive. They thought they were justified in punishing these people because they killed their friends, et cetera. But that's where the moral justification becomes highly problematic.
And also that the public is complicit in this to a certain degree as well.
Yeah.
That we shouldn't always think of these new narratives being created by the big bad government.
Mm-hmm.
There's been quite a lot of work done on the number of torture scenes in US media and phone media in general, particularly in US film and television. And effectively after 2001, there's a massive shift, not only in the number of torture scenes depicted, it increases by something like 1,000%, but the way that it's depicted. Prior to 2001, it was the good guy getting tortured by the bad guy and overcoming it. Post 2001, it's the good guy having to torture the bad guy to get the information and then to save the day. And it's a really obvious shift. So, like I said, this is Hollywood being complicit in telling these new narratives. It's not just coming from kind of government propaganda.
That's really fascinating, and it's absolutely something that the Visualising War project is really interested in. And it becomes very worrying and problematic when we think about the feedback loop between narrative and reality. You've talked, Rory, about the way in which language constructs reality, and narrative storytelling more generally construct reality. They don't just reflect what's going on, but they shape and inform what happens. So we talked a little bit about the way in which, Tony, you just mentioned the way in which ethics, legal language, politics and so on come together in storytelling and justifications. And I think one thing that struck me when Rory was mentioning the waterboarding example was the amnesia, actually, or this deliberate obfuscation or kind of overlooking of history. And that got me thinking a little bit about what role history itself plays in this storytelling. What role historical exemplar play in justifications of war, going back to sort of justifications of war generally, not just torture. I wonder if, Tony, if you have any examples of that you want to bring out.
So the classic one, of course, as Rory mentioned before, is the kind of Greco-Roman tradition. But you, as both as classicists, know this much better than I would. But both in, I think, the way older traditions, like late 19th, early 20th century, people thought about war was very much through that lens of the Greeks and the Romans. But it's also today. I mean, look at the film 300, right? I mean, talk about a representation of warfare that is, completely fictional. I mean, it's obviously based on a true event, but didn't quite look that way. And I have seen references to lines from that movie in kind of the way military folks sometimes will think. The whole narrative about how you're fighting for your freedom. I mean, look at Braveheart, right? I mean, the freedom, the whole thing. That is something that you see referenced in the U.S. a lot, even though the U.S. is usually the oppressor today, not the kind of liberator. So I think certainly those kind of Hollywood visualizations of warfare make their way into how people want to see themselves. We want to see ourselves as these heroes who are fighting the big bad guys, right? Again, the 300 is such a great example of this. The group of just 300 Spartan warriors versus this evil, horrible empire of the Persians who are faceless, literally, because they wear those masks in the movie. But it's interesting to see how that becomes a narrative that makes sense of the evil big empire that you're fighting against. And I think that resonates. It does resonate in the United States because Americans still think of themselves as strangely fighting against bad guys all over the world when, I mean, I don't want to say that America's a bad guy. It's a big, powerful empire that's doing a lot of things around the world. And the kind of mismatch, I think, between these things is sometimes amazing to me, that they don't see themselves as the Persians in that movie as opposed to the Greeks. So I'm sure Rory has way more. And Rory's work, I should say, his book that's going to be coming out on the ancient world is terrific because it looks to Egypt, ancient Israelite, really interesting examples. And this is what I like about Rory's work is that it's bringing out examples from history that we wouldn't think of and that we don't normally go to, but seeing actually what's going on here has resonance in different ways, and we can see this making its way in a long kind of trajectory. It's always fascinating to me that the biblical stories don't get invoked very much in the way people think about warfare. And I've always been struck by this because there's a lot of war in the Old Testament, but that never really gets invoked by people in the public realm, and not as much as you would think.
And picking up on biblical narrative, I think that's a really good point. If we generally accept that the modern Western just war tradition is derived from the medieval tradition, which was derived from late antique Christian theology, then it's very obvious that, Christian theology drew from the Old Testament. They did try to take some stuff from the New Testament, but it's pretty hard to glean, pro-war information from the New Testament. So really Christian theologizing, is highly dependent on the Old Testament and the wars and the massacres and the looting and pillaging and rape that takes place in it, along with pre-existing Greco-Roman ideas about kind of the legalism of war and various kind of Stoic ideas about war particularly. As Tony says, this is not really often referred to, and I think it's partly because of a shift around the 17th century, or arguably perhaps a tiny bit earlier, but largely from Grotius onwards, Hugo Grotius, that tried to kind of clean the religion out of warfare and to base war on ideas of either custom or natural law. Now, the irony, of course, is that anyone who actually goes and reads Hugo Grotius's work on the rights of war and peace will see that it's absolutely chock full of biblical references. And that continued to be the case for a lot of work. But yeah, Tony's right that there has been a desire in the West in the early modern and modern period to see war as governed by either positive law, custom, and that it's not, influenced by things like religious prejudice or considerations. When of course, the whole basis of a lot of our modern understanding of positive law and of custom are derived from religious morals and religious law and religious philosophy in general.
Yeah, this idea of fighting for a good cause. Obviously, that often presupposes that you're representing the good cause and that you're on the side of the good, which is inherently, in a way, that's a religious idea, and that's the idea, obviously, that you find in the Old Testament, where there's the thinking very strongly that the people of Israel is supported by God, also in military action against the various foes and enemies that emerge in the course of the tradition. So, I find it very interesting, Rory, what you were saying about how it's sort of difficult to separate these things because they've become so interwoven.
Yeah, the great irony about the just war tradition is that it's essentially entirely relative. That, as you say, nobody ever thinks that they're the bad guys, that they're waging an unjust war, that they're the criminals. Now, this, of course, is what the modern analytic strain of thought attempts to do. It attempts to create an objective set of criteria and claims that you can make an objective judgment about justice and injustice. But I find that deeply unconvincing because first of all, I'm not convinced about the idea of objective justice full stop, as if there's some sort of universal principle of justice. I know Tony disagrees with me on this. But I think even if you did get to that, the way that it's immediately interpreted by people, it becomes subjective and relative. Effectively, if you are at your most cynical, the just war tradition does question the relationship between justice and war, but whoever is utilizing it will always end up with the answers that they want, and that is that their war is justified and that their actions were justifiable. And that is one of the great kind of ironies and weaknesses of the just war tradition, that it does tend to be subjective, essentially.
Well, I suppose it's a cultural discourse like any other. And one of the important tasks of the study of the just war tradition, also in academia, is to point this out and to make sure that people always see these narratives in their complexity and in their cultural and political bias as kind of bias towards the person who narrates them, who creates them, and never take them for granted. Just like the war movies or what happens in Hollywood movies, when it's not enough to say, oh, look at the Hollywood movie, that's proof that this is how people are thinking, so it's okay to do that. It's important to see this as part of this ongoing shaping of thinking, of concepts, and not as a matter of fact. One of the important elements of studying the just war tradition is pointing out exactly this, isn't it? That every narrative has to be scrutinized, analyzed critically.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we talk as well about the just war tradition rather than the just war doctrine, because the tradition is not monolithic in any sense of the word. What we're talking about is actually a very wide variety of different ideas that are undoubtedly loosely connected, and you can put them under these umbrella terms of things like, jus ad bellum and jus in bello and jus postbellum. But, there is no uniformity within those streams of thought. And so, looking at the ideas of the Israelites, for example, compared to the ideas of the Egyptians, or the ideas of certain medieval canonists compared to the ideas of certain medieval secular philosophers, compared to the ideas of someone like Grotius, or Pufendorf versus Vattel, or then, how that body of law is translated into, say, the UN conventions. Variety is actually the definition of these streams of thought rather than uniformity. And so while it's a tradition in the sense that it can all be kind of broadly categorized and discussed and compared, it is not a single idea or a single set of ideas. And again, that perhaps underlines the fact that it is therefore culturally contingent a lot of the time.
So there are lots of different philosophical traditions and lots of different political interpretations of those philosophical traditions. But then there are also outcomes and impacts of all of this. I think this takes us to Tony a little bit and your work on obligations and responsibilities. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the way in which the evolution of the just war tradition has impacted on the evolution of sense of international obligations, state obligations, the obligations that aid agencies and NGOs feel they have as well in the context of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting. So there's an international legal discourse around responsibility, which is that states are responsible for their populations, and this has come out. It's not a legal doctrine. There was some debate about this. The responsibility to protect, which arose out of a commission in a Canadian government organized commission in 2000 and 2001, and they promulgated a series of arguments that states should, first of all, be responsible for their own populations, and when they fail, then the international community has to step in and be responsible, which can include using military force if necessary. What's interesting about that is it's not been invoked very often, and some people would say almost never, other than by academics or NGOs or humanitarian actors wanting more action to prevent atrocities. The probably one place where it was closest to being invoked was the 2011 intervention in Libya. There was a Security Council resolution which referred to, in small letters, not capital letters. So there's a big debate about, if it's capital letters, it's the official doctrine. If it's not, it's not. But to the responsibility to protect in the context, Security Council resolution that authorized action by Britain, France, and the United States invoked that norm. And if you look at the responsibility to protect, some of the issues that were in that initial report sound very much like the just war tradition. So they're very much about the authority. There has to be right authority, and that is the Security Council. There has to be right intention, and then the in bello stuff also an operative there too. So it's interesting that there is this discourse that's emerged. It's not whether or not it's really making that much of a difference in the way states operate. I'm not entirely sure. You would hope it would be, and you would hope it would avoid some of the colonial elements that were so much part of those same kind of claims and going back through time, right? I mean, every big, great power claims it has a responsibility to help. You could look at Germany's invasion of the Sudetenland was to protect Germans there from whatever. So there is a kind of responsibility language can be overused, of course, but maybe there's something there that's corresponding to some sort of global awareness of the need to think more ethically about how to protect populations from atrocities.
And I wonder if we can come back to Rory's point as well about, the just war tradition being something that sits with civilian populations and the media as much as policymakers and military people. Obviously, the war in Iraq and the lack of WMD, and then the very attritional conflict in Afghanistan has really shaped how general populations visualize war. And, we're recording this at a point when obviously the Biden administration is withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, and everyone's wondering what on earth is about to happen in Afghanistan next, and what obligations actually does the US and the wider coalition have to supporting that region post-withdrawal.
I would say, certainly globalization and our ability to see atrocities around the world created a slightly different way of thinking. I can remember when I was getting my PhD at Johns Hopkins in the early 90s, and this is, obviously when the internet's just kind of starting, and this was when the wars were happening in the Balkans. And I can remember like a listserv or something, and I was seeing commentary from people who were in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I was like, oh my gosh, we can actually see what there weren't images, it was all just text, but you're starting to see, oh, you can hear what's going on around the world. I don't have to wait to 2 days later for the paper to come. So I think the immediacy now of seeing atrocities is one thing. But that's the downside of that is things can be, fictionalized very quickly in the media, right? I mean, you could say, look at this horrible thing that's happened, but out of context, it may make no sense. And so the immediate, I think, good response from people, like, we want to help these people, they're being killed or they're being tortured or whatever bad thing is happening, without understanding the wider context, leads states to maybe sometimes act more quickly and without thinking, or use that as a cover for their own interests. I think there's both a good side to globalization and that immediacy, then there's the bad side. And that's the narrative question, right? How we narrate these conflicts becomes highly problematic. And the Afghanistan one is a classic example of this. Has been the graveyard of empires. Afghanistan was called, going back to the British and then the Soviets and post 2001, how we narrate what Afghanistan is. It's only about how great powers have failed there, as opposed to thinking about what's going on for people in Afghanistan themselves.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, Vietnam is often cited as a war which really changed things because it was the first televised war. Yeah. And I think that has had a massive impact, and building on what Tony has said, because going back to our previous points about people don't usually want to see themselves as the villains. And so when you see your armed forces behaving inappropriately or ruthlessly or savagely, that will often have a public backlash. A public has to be so kind of vehemently opposed to an other for them to be able to approve that sort of behavior. Most of the time that isn't the case. So I think the televisation and the globalization and communication and the way that war is reported and how it's immediate, like Tony has said now, does have an impact on publics, and that therefore has an impact on government policies and their willingness or their reticence to become involved. I also think that there's a fundamental challenge for scholars in dealing with war as we go into the future, because we tend to think of narratives as literary genres, nice tracts, extended romances, whatever it may be, philosophical musings. But the way that war is going to be narrated increasingly is through, 140 character tweets or short videos on the internet for a variety of different sites. Now that is all a version of narrating conflict, and it arguably is going to do much more to influence public perceptions of conflict than if I write a piece in, the Times, or if Tony writes another book on, the ethics of intervention, or whatever it may be. So I think as scholars, we have our work cut out for us to adjust our way of thinking about narrative and warfare and the influence of those very immediate, one might say sort of brief, one might say inaccurate, one might say potent and emotive narrations of warfare that will become more and more dominant, I think. And also just, the mass of them, how as scholars do we possibly keep up? How do we farm that information and material in order to analyze it? These, I think, are major challenges to the study of war and ethics and justice and various other fields as well.
I think Rory's got a great point there. I think we as scholars need to start thinking, those of us who are writing about war and justice or history and et cetera, need to think about different literary forms or different ways in which we do narrate things. And I think that's, Rory's point's a great one, because narration is no longer, long tracks. It's these short things that we have to somehow grapple with, and their emotive potential becomes that much more powerful. Whether or not they're visual images or text or whatever, we have to think and bring that into our way of thinking about war, I think is crucial, which is why your project is so useful, because it's getting on all these different levels, getting us to think about how we represent war and how it gets represented more widely.
And there is some really fascinating work on war in the digital age. So one of our recent podcast guests, Donatella De La Rata, works on this and has really looked at the handheld iPhone reportage of the conflict in Syria, for example. But she also looks at who gets to archive this stuff, the big social media platforms, who decides which of these narratives are kept and which are deleted. And all of that factors into cultural memory, our historical memory of what was narrated as having been just or justified, and what was narrated as having been totally unjustified and inappropriate and so on. So it will be really, really fascinating to look back at one of the challenges, this huge dossier of electronic tweets and the digital archive that's out there.
Just to jump in on that, Alice, there's a great book, and it's dated now, but it's still relevant, I think, by a guy named James Derderian, called Virtuous War. And it came out in the 90s or something. And he did this really fascinating thing where he went to U.S. military war colleges and service academies and talked with them about how they were integrating video games into training for war. And there's a whole, so he updated it a few years ago, but it's fascinating, of course, because so many young people, that's how they, they relax, they play video games, etc. And the way those representations of war in those are crucial. That's the way kids think about what is it legit. And they're often these first-person shooter ones where you're the soldier who has to make decisions about killing, whether they're aliens or other people. That's going to shape the way people think about what justifies war. And I don't know if you guys have done a project on this yet, but to do something on video games would be really fascinating, and how these shape warfare.
We have been touching on that, and we've also got someone coming up. And one of the things that he said that's really fascinating for the Just War tradition is the fact that the majority of war games, and I think it's just called gaming, the majority of these games do not and cannot involve civilians, because otherwise you might get people who just enjoy shooting civilians. So one of the things that you're then doing is extracting from a war game some of the really big challenges around the justification of war. So either jus ad bellum or indeed jus in bello. And so you're absolutely right. And in fact, I was about to ask you guys what impact you think wargaming has or will have going forward on ideas of justice, ideas of obligation and responsibility in conflict.
I think what's interesting is these are, as I said, and I'm not at all an expert in this stuff, either academically or personally, but it is interesting how some of it is individualized, if that makes sense. It's you as an individual soldier doing things. And, and again, I don't know the universe of gaming. There are, of course, big empire games. I'm knowing this because my kids play these too. But it does seem like that individualization of what I can and can't do in warfare, it's no longer about what my commander or my political system is telling me. It's about, I got to make decisions on the ground right now. That seems to me something that's, I would think, problematic. We think of military people in command units and they should be obeying commands, and we hope those commands are good ones. And that hierarchy makes sense for how you can conduct a war. So I think there might be something there. That would be my one thought about this gaming universe. Maybe it's the individualization of war.
Yeah, I think Tony's absolutely right about that. I would have 2 points. First of all is that as technology advances, these experiences become increasingly visceral and realistic. And I'm sure, 3D interactive virtual environments in every home, or in every home that wants them, are really not that far away. So once you get that kind of visceral experience, that's all very well. But of course, it's connected to absolutely zero repercussions. You can get killed numerous times. You can shoot a civilian in the head, and maybe you get, that's the end of your turn or whatever. But, there are games that you can do these things. So that is one worrying aspect, I think, that the experience is becoming more realistic, but ultimately it's completely detached from reality. And perhaps that becomes less obvious, that when it's, poor, Tetris graphics duping across the screen, people will be inclined to think that it is real when it's actually, as you say, not. And the second aspect, I think, which perhaps is even more worrying, is the age in which children are engaging with this material. And if you want to talk about indoctrination, well, indoctrination about warfare and propaganda and ideology, of course, is as old as history itself. And, the youth have always been indoctrinated into thinking about war through various means, but that's often been controlled by certain cultural or authority organizations and institutions. However, you're getting kids, 4, 5, 6 years old, engaging with what are, some less violent, some more like violent games. And that is shaping the way they think about violence more generally. And we could have a discussion about domestic violence and interpersonal violence as well. But they're also shaping the way they think about warfare with essentially very few controls. And again, they're still thinking about warfare as detached from reality, that it somehow can be sterile and clean, and you can make up for mistakes later. Well, of course, that's not the case. People die, people are maimed, people's lives are destroyed, and you can't just go and press restart on these things.
It makes me wonder to what extent then actual warfare, especially drone warfare, where you're sitting in front of a computer screen, and I don't have any direct experience with this, but from what I've seen represented, it looks strikingly like what you see when you're gaming on the computer screen. So you wonder how the boundaries between this and actual war action then become blurred, and in some ways that might make it easier to kind of pull the trigger in a way. I don't know.
That's a really interesting. So I'm actually co-supervising a student who's in the IR department in St Andrews with a Professor Philippa O'Brien, and she is looking at drone pilots particularly and their integration in the US and UK militaries, but also their experience of combat and I'm not sure if you're aware, but drone pilots have a very, very high rate of depression, alcoholism, drug dependency, and suicide, higher than the average rate for the armed forces, which is already saying something. That's also lent to by the fact that they feel kind of excluded, that they're not proper warriors, because they're not risking their lives. Their medal system, for example, is not totally comparable to the kind of the standard field medals that can be awarded for bravery and other such things. But one of the things that repeatedly comes up with the testimonies of drone pilots is actually the opposite of that, Nicolas. We would expect for it to be divorced to a certain extent, but actually the reality is that these drone pilots often have an intimate, or what they feel is an intimate relationship with their targets. The technology on these drones is so good that they can literally kind of see the pimples on the faces of their targets, and they don't just see them and blow them up straight away. They often trace them and track them for days, if not weeks, and then perhaps a decision is made. One of the things that they say is they actually get to know their enemies in a way that a modern soldier, in a firefight on a battlefield, would not know their enemy, and then still have to pull the trigger and again see the damage that is caused. See the limbs and the body parts scattered all over the pavement or whatever it may be. So I think you're right that we think of drone warfare as separated from the reality of the battlefield to a certain extent, but actually when you start talking to the operators themselves, that may not necessarily be the case. And the trauma, the psychological trauma, is actually quite significant. Added to that, of course, they have no decompression time. These drone pilots finish their shift, drive home and go and have dinner with their family. Whereas, a soldier in a combat zone on a tour will be with his comrades or her comrades, will then have a period of decompression when they leave that theatre of war, and then return to quote unquote normal civilian life when they get leave. That kind of division, that psychological distinction between warfare and civilian normal everyday life, again, is not there for drone pilots. And I think, again, that has a massive kind of impact on their welfare.
Extremely interesting. And again, it brings up this question of blurred boundaries and how sort of, the boundaries between the soldier and the civilian are blurred because on both sides of the equation in a way, including the transition from soldiering into civilian life. That's very, very interesting. It also sounds like there is still a lot to do on just war studies, and there is a lot of new challenging material coming our way. So before we let you go, Tony and Rory, what's next on your agenda?
Okay, so I have one that does connect a bit more to the Visualizing War. It has to do with fairy tales. So the basic idea is in 1939, J.R.R. Tolkien came to St. Andrews, and he gave a famous talk, which was called On Fairy Stories. It was the Andrew Lang Lecture. And Andrew Lang was a 19th century, 20th century early anthropologist who did this big collection of fairy tales and collected these fairy tales. So Tolkien, who was the author of The Lord of the Rings, came and gave this talk. He tried to define what is a fairy story. In the lecture, he coined a phrase called a eucatastrophe. And he says, this is what defines a fairy tale. And a eucatastrophe is a story that has a happy ending. He also said in every fairy tale, the hero makes a poor decision that seems like a really bad decision in the middle of the story, but in the end turns out to be a good thing. So it helps and makes the happy ending possible. In his own fairy tale, in The Lord of the Rings, it's the decision by Bilbo not to kill Gollum, and that's what enabled the ring to be destroyed, blah, blah, blah. So how does this relate to just war? So one of the things I've been thinking of is how communities narrate their wars. And if you notice, they always want to say it was a happy ending. Now, I said this in another context with another colleague, and she was like, wars are horrible. They don't have happy endings. And of course, I know that. But the way we narrate wars, especially as we get further and further away from them, is they must have a happy ending. Even if we had horrible things happen in the middle of them, there seems to be some necessity to having a happy ending in a war. I think so this would be a very structuralist literary argument, that there is a structure that seems to exist in how we understand very difficult, conflictual things like wars, that we need happy endings. And why is that? Is that something internal to the human condition that we have to narrate war this way? And then try to map that on to particular ways in which we understand wars and try to dig into the specific narratives, like what bad things happened that somehow contributed to the happy ending. We couldn't have won without this. So that's the basic idea.
That sounds really fascinating, Tony. The idea actually almost that the Just War tradition is in itself some kind of a fairy tale, or that it deals in fairy tales, that one of the things you're doing at the start of a conflict is trying to visualize the happy ending, the benefits that are going to outweigh the costs. And Rory, can we just come to you? What's in the pipeline for you?
So I'm just finishing off a long-term project, a book that will hopefully be out sometime next year, called The Origins of the Just War, which looks at the kind of the earliest evidence for just war thought or ethical thought about war from ancient Egypt, ancient Hatti, and the ancient Israelites. So from the sort of early 3rd millennium to the mid 1st millennium BCE. Tony and I are actually also editing a volume called Contesting Torture, which looks at responses to torture and how torture is narrated and conceived and challenged. So that also hopefully should be out next year. In the future, I'm increasingly interested in the impact of violence and the environment, also potentially cultural heritage sites as well. So I may be doing something on that, but I may also take a step away from war and violence for a year or so. After this year's COVID crisis, to do more war and more violence after 15 years of it, sometimes I think I need a palate cleanser, and then I'll get back to it.
So lots of really interesting stuff to look forward to from both of you. Tony and Rory, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We've greatly enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot about the Just War tradition.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you from me as well. It's just so fascinating to look at the Just War tradition as a way in which so many people have visualized war in different periods and places. We hope that you, our listeners, have enjoyed this conversation as much as we have with Dr. Rory Cox and Professor Anthony Lang. Please do join us again next week when we'll be talking to another academic, Dr. Roddy Brett, who's based at the University of Bristol. Roddy's work connects in lots of ways to what we've been talking about today. His research focuses on conflict resolution and peace building, particularly transitional justice, including where genocide has taken place. So we'll be asking him about the processes and strategies, and indeed the narratives that help individuals and groups visualize peace and move away from armed conflict. He's also involved actually in a collective research project looking at the prolonged impact of viewing violence in films and how visualizations of conflict on screen can hamper as well as sometimes help peace processes. So we've got a lot to talk to him about, and we hope that you can join us again next Wednesday for that. Please do subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. Please share it with your friends and maybe leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show.
And if you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualizing War, or get in touch with us directly by emailing at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Sophia Gertin. Thank you for listening.